Hello folks, I'm UK Air Rifleman, and in this instructional movie I would like to share my experience, fieldcraft, and some of the advice I have learned from others regarding hunting wood pigeons with air rifles. Shooting wood pigeons with air rifles is definitely not the normal way to go about hunting these birds, and most field sports enthusiasts would go so far as to say it's extremely unusual to do so. But for those that do, they find it a worthwhile and fulfilling challenge. Most of the equipment and methods used by the Air Rifle Marksman are basically adapted from the experiences of those that use shotguns to control them, especially where decoys are used. But some of us, who either do not have access to a shotgun or just prefer the challenge of using an air rifle, will hopefully find this video useful. In fact, having used shotguns and high-powered rifles of various calibers in the past, I actually prefer to shoot pigeons with air rifles overall. There's a few reasons for that. One is that the meat is not peppered with lead shot. Others are that the air rifle is quiet and therefore subtle, and can be used close to dwellings, which is an advantage on my main permission, as its eastern boundaries are village gardens. My permission is also crisscrossed by public footpaths. This might sound strange to some, but as well as my quarry not knowing I'm there, I like the fact Joe Public doesn't know I'm there too. We all know about the ignorance of Joe Public, but let's stick to the subject. I also use air rifles as I'm not interested in taking a huge bag of birds home, as I shoot for the table on the whole and take what I need and no more. I also like to think that the standard of fieldcraft required to decoy a pigeon to the ground, within range, and unaware of my presence, is much higher. I don't have anything against using shotguns for pigeon control. In fact, it is the most effective and efficient method to do it, and I have thoroughly enjoyed the few pigeon days I've had using a beautiful over and under 12 gauge under supervision, but I still took the air rifle with me on the day. In order to hunt any animal, it is important to know its habits intimately, so I will begin with a quick profile of the bird and explain why it is a bird that we are allowed to control. The wood pigeon, Columba palambus, is a gregarious medium-sized bird that is almost entirely grey, but on closer inspection the breast plumage is a shade of browny pink, and there is also light blue-grey plumage on its back. The wings have white bars on them, whether they are juvenile or mature. This is the most important identifying feature that distinguishes juvenile birds from the stock dove, which is a protected species. Mature birds also have white neck bars. The cockbird will have thicker neck bars than the hen. The wings and tail are tipped with black. The wood pigeon is an agricultural pest that was once only found in small numbers in the UK as a migrant visitor, but since the agricultural revolution in the 1950s and the introduction of intensive arable farming methods, the bird is now a resident species, found in huge numbers all over the UK, all year round. Despite its name being the wood pigeon, its habitat is quite diverse. In the countryside it is found in woodlands, as its name suggests, and also out in the fields, feeding on a huge variety of flora, berries, seeds and grain, but it is also a commonly seen bird in our towns and cities. However, in the towns and cities it is not considered a pest, and it is illegal to shoot them in most circumstances, unless you are protecting your own garden produce, and all other non-lethal methods have been exhausted. Generally an extremely wary bird in the countryside, they can be almost fearless in the urban environment. This will leave some new air rifle huntsmen scratching their heads as to why they can't get near them in the field, yet can almost trip over them in the towns and gardens. So as I've mentioned the legalities, I will go into more detail. The wood pigeon is currently listed on the general licence for the control of pest birds, and the primary reason for this is for the purposes of crop protection. It is listed for other reasons such as disease, but as mentioned it is primarily an arable farm pest. The general licence is a part of the Wildlife and Countryside Act of 1981. The Act's primary purpose is to protect wildlife. The best way to interpret the legislation is to assume that all birds are protected under the Act, but there are a few exceptions. These exceptional species are listed, and lethal control can only be used as a last resort where non-lethal control methods are proven not to be working. That is when the license comes into effect, and it's general because it does not need to be applied for. The license primarily covers the landowner and their authorised third parties. That would be us, the Air Rifle Marksman. At the time of recording this video, the general licenses are undergoing a few changes due to legal challenges from those that also would like to protect wildlife, and so the advice given in this video should not be taken as gospel, and I highly recommend you look them up and read them yourself for the latest information. The best place to find them is at www.basc.org. For example, as I record this video, another agricultural pest bird, closely related to the wood pigeon, has been removed from the licence and is now fully protected. This species is called the collared dove. The wood pigeon also has the added bonus of being a very tasty meal and a highly prized quarry species as a result. The wood pigeon, being an extremely gregarious bird, can cause huge damage to arable crops when a large flock descends upon a field. They damage planted, shooting and standing crops. The animal is capable of consuming, individually, a fist-sized amount of food items and storing them in a large crop. This amount of feed is consumed 2 to 3 times a day by each pigeon. Imagine a flock of several thousand birds consuming that amount of arable produce, and the yield from that field will be reduced by several tons. They can also present themselves as a farmyard pest by taking expensive grain-based livestock feeds. Not generally known to be a disease risk like feral pigeons, they do pose a risk to livestock by dunging over their feed, but the wood pigeon does not generally frequent farmyards as much as corvids and feral pigeons. To target wood pigeon, we need to go out to the fields and into the woods on the whole. And on that note, we shall move on to the unique tactics used by the Air Rifle Marksman to target these birds. The tactics used to target wood pigeon vary as the year passes and the bird's diet changes. It is important to know, or at least have an idea, where your pigeons are to be found as a result. Reconnaissance and a helpful farmer are extremely important in this regard. If you do your homework prior to the shooting day, you will find you will be rewarded with a good day's shooting. Observation of the birds on your permission should hopefully reveal common routes for the birds known as flight lines. A flight line is normally associated with a landmark that the pigeons use as a navigational aid. These can be anything from a set of power or telephone lines, a road, an individual tree, rivers and streams, hedgerows or even a building. Motorways are especially known to have flight lines along them, for example. It is important to ascertain where these flight lines are for the purposes of decoying. Finding trees that the birds regularly sit in, known as city trees, and also roosting areas is highly important. Popular trees for pigeons are high trees covered in ivy, especially in the winter time. If the birds are not present at the time, but droppings are found, it's a good indicator something is roosting there. Fields that have been recently harvested, cut or planted are very good locations to try your luck, even if prior observation hasn't been possible. This is another reason why good communication with the landowner is important, as you can be given prior knowledge of these events and plan your ambush with precision. However, in my experience, decoying normal grass fields grazed by livestock can work, especially if the fields have some clover present. You would be surprised how well this can work, especially prior to harvest time. The first method I will cover is probably the most productive, as it allows you to place the birds almost exactly where you need them. This is a form of static hunting using a hide and decoys. Decoying wood pigeons for shooting with an air rifle differs to the tactics used by shotgunners, primarily because we need them to land and sit still. Shotgunners can take their quarry on the wing, therefore several parts of the method are slightly different. The main differences lie with the way the height is built and arranged, and the number and types of decoys used. So, I'll kick off with the decoys. On the market is a huge array of decoys, all mainly aimed at the shotgunner, but they will work for the Air Rifle Marksman too, if you choose the right ones. As stated in the Corvid Control instructional movie, the best decoy is actually the real thing. A shot bird propped up in the field, but this isn't always possible, so an artificial decoy must be used. There are so many out there I will not go into too much detail, but generally the flocked and photorealistic ones are best. It is also recommended to stick to full-bodied ones. However, the full-bodied decoys are bulky, especially as it is recommended to use 6 to 12 of them. If you can carry them, then great, but most of us can't, so what do we use instead? Well, with personal experience I have found the NRA fold-up decoys, or FUDs for short, to be extremely good. They are made from neoprene, can be packed flat, and then expanded to be an almost full-bodied decoy. They are also photorealistic and UV painted. The birds can see in the UV spectrum, and their white wing and neck bars stand out in this spectrum especially. The other is the flock shell decoy. These are good, but as standard they need a little help. I actually use a white UV paint to augment the wing bars and the neck bars. They work well on stubble fields that have just been harvested. This is because the hollow body is less apparent to the target bird, but they do not work so well on fields that have just been planted or on short grass and clover. The sight of the hollow underbody spooks the birds. My setup is primarily the NRA fold-up decoys, but I also use shells with success too. I must reiterate that the advice is to use full-bodied wherever possible, however. The whirlies, flappers, etc. do not work so well for the air gunner, but a shot bird set up as a bouncer can work well. A bouncer is where a long stick is placed inside the body from the rectum all the way up to the base of the head, with a crossbar known as a spreader to support the wings in the gliding position. The long stick is pushed into the ground at an angle facing into the wind. The bird looks like it is coming into land and bounces in the wind. So why flocked or photorealistic? Well, the painted decoys have several problems related with them from my experience and from what I have learned from others. My experience has found that the paintwork leaves something to be desired in that it chips, and from my learning from others, despite them having a matte finish, they also shine in the sun or when wet, which is worse than a scarecrow for pigeons. So how many do we use? For many years I used only half a dozen FUDs. These were steadily replaced by shot birds if the day went really well and it was a cool day. My primary reasons for shooting wood pigeons was for food, and a large bag is a challenge to achieve, so leaving birds out in the sun wasn't something I did very much. Shotgunners, on the other hand, that make bags in the high double and triple figures, could afford to make a pattern entirely out of shot birds and replace the artificial decoys. There are entire books written on decoy patterns, and there are so many it's unbelievable, but the general idea is to arrange them roughly facing into the wind, with a pronounced hole in the middle of the pattern known as the kill zone. The decoys should be placed between 3 to 10 yards apart. I use 3 main patterns in my experience. When I was inexperienced, I used a rough diamond shaped pattern of 6 NRA fold-up decoys. There were 4 birds down the middle with 2 outliers, 10 yards perpendicular to the third pigeon out, as shown in the diagram. Before the days of having a rangefinder, I used the middle line of decoys as range markers as well as attractors. In fact, as my experience grew and I learnt about better patterns, I still utilise this idea for quick target acquisition, and I recommend you do it too. The middle line in front of the hide had a decoy at 10, 20, 30 and 40 yards. This pattern worked great for me, but it also meant the kill zone was crowded and the pigeons landed haphazardly, some out of range, but the wind direction was unimportant with this pattern, which was an advantage. I then watched a video by Hunter's Vermin, and he used U and L-shaped patterns using up to 12 decoys. The diagram shows a 6-bird U-shaped pattern, but 12 bird patterns can be used. Just place the birds 5 yards apart instead of 10 yards. The point of the pattern, for example the trough of the U, should be facing into the wind and be directly in front of the hide if possible. But the U can be rotated to utilise crosswinds too. This pattern does not work so well with a direct headwind, as there is not enough time for the birds to land, as the decoys are unsighted by the hedgerow or tree line until the last moment. But if the hedge is fairly low, an inverted U can be used. I recommend placing the whole pattern 5 to 10 yards further out in this case. 9 out of 10 times the birds will land facing into the wind. The legs of the U should be about 20 yards apart, leaving a nice landing area and therefore a pronounced kill zone. The L-shaped pattern shown in this diagram is extremely versatile. The diagram shows a left to right wind situation. The decoys can also be used as range markers and also allow a nice large area for the pigeons to land. Again, the diagram shows a 6-bird pattern, but 12 birds can be used again at 5-yard spacings. The L can also be rotated and inverted to utilise all wind directions or more effectively steer the birds where you want them. But again, a headwind is not ideal, and an inverted L pattern placed 5 to 10 yards further out than usual is recommended. Overall, my personal preference is the L-shaped pattern. In all the diagrams I have shown a single corvid decoy as an outlier to the main pattern, but still in range. This acts as both reassurement for the pigeons and also to allow the chance of a secondary target in the form of corvids. The L-shaped pattern is the best pattern to use if you intend to use a corvid decoy, as it allows you to place it relatively far away from the pigeons, but keep it at a reasonable range to the hide. This is also more natural as they tend to keep their distance from one another. It is entirely optional, but I have had success doing it. So that's the deeks covered. What do we do next? Well, a hide is the way forward. I've covered hides in a lot of detail in the Corvid Control Air Rifle Fieldcraft video, as it is an extremely important part of the fieldcraft required to target them. I suggest you take a look there for more information. The pigeon hide, however, is a slightly more relaxed affair. You can set up in daylight. In fact, an afternoon is considered the busy period for this type of shooting. The pigeons generally feed twice a day, first thing in the morning at dawn and in the late afternoon. On long summer days this can be extended to 3 times, including an evening feed. In between these times the birds are perched in trees digesting their meals, either in their regular roost or a city tree. A basic hide can be constructed using a doubled up camouflage net, supported by a frame and tent pegs to stop it flapping in the wind. The frame must be high enough to cover you sitting down. A basic guide is to have it at armpit height when standing, but a better guide is to try to match the height of the hedge you are shooting out of to aid blending it in. You do not shoot over the top of the net, but through it, either through a hole cut into it or in a deliberately bald area of the net cover. A roof on the hide is not so important, but it is recommended you set up under the canopy of a tree with a dense hedgerow behind you. The best hide sites are places where the hedgerow has receded into a bay, has thick vegetation behind you, and is also under a large thick tree canopy. If you can set up with a tree in range, this can also help you get chances. The net can have weeds and other flora weaved into it to further augment concealment, but again, this is certainly not absolutely necessary where pigeon shooting is concerned. If you are unsure whether you can cut it, don't. It's the quickest way to lose a shoot if you chop a farmer's hedge to pieces. A useful tip is to use a camo tarpaulin to cover the front lower half from the inside. This completely masks any movements of the feet and legs and the movement of lifting the rifle for a shot. Another option for constructing a hide is the pop-up hide I covered in the Corvid control video. Further broken up with a camo net, these can be placed practically anywhere. During the harvest, bales of straw can be utilised to make a hide right in the middle of the field, if circumstances ask for it too. The clothing worn should be camouflaged and cover as much skin as possible. The muzzle or silencer of the rifle should be camoed up too. An unusual but massively effective method of concealment is to use a ghillie suit, full matching camouflage for the rifle and shooting sticks with a low seat. Tuck yourself into the hedgerow or other available cover as much as possible and move very, very slowly when attempting to bring the rifle on aim. This method requires perfect camouflage and a massive amount of discipline. If you are the fidgety kind, this method isn't for you. A cheap ghillie suit can be constructed from a camo net made into a hooded poncho, and any spare offcuts can be used to drape over the rifle and sticks. I haven't tried this method myself, as I am a little fidgety, but I admit to being highly impressed by the method, having seen it used in the field by hunters' vermin, accounting for 18 birds, some as close as 6 yards away. This method can also be used to target a city tree without decoys. So, we're all set. What next? Well, hopefully we will see lots of pigeons land in the pattern and not take off again. You have done your observations, you know where the pigeons are and where the flight lines are. The hide is concealing you well and the decoys are working. You may not hit the first bird, but chances will come again if you miss. It's obvious when you see a bird that's committed to the decoys. While it is gliding in, get the rifle into the rough position it needs to be in before it lands. Then shoulder the rifle properly once it's landed. This reduces the chances of the bird spotting the movement of you or the exposed muzzle, as during landing it's too busy concentrating on the landing spot itself, rather than looking for air gunners with a taste of pigeon breasts on their lips. Make a mental note of the nearest range marking decoy to the landed bird, and apply the required point of aim accordingly. If you have a crosswind, then it's good practice to pop a thick stick in the ground at your zero range and take a few practice shots to ascertain the approximate windage. You may find the pigeon a fidgety target, so shot timing is essential. It's best to wait till the bird is still before you squeeze the trigger. The shot placement on the pigeon is almost exclusively the head and neck, but if the bird has its back to you, a shot between the wings and high up its back will result in a clean heart, lung or spine shot. It is possible to achieve heart and lung shots from the front, but if the bird has a full crop, you will just wound the bird. A heart and lung shot via the shoulder when presented with a side-on view is possible too, but it needs to be perfectly placed. It's important not to leave the hide unless a shot bird has rolled onto its back, or you have wounded a bird. Headshot birds tend to do a lot of flapping and rolling around initially and look wounded. This is because the brain has been destroyed and the animal is dead, but the reflex nervous impulses from the spinal cord are still firing, but it will cease fairly quickly. However, if it's a hot day and you want to preserve your birds for the table, then get out of the hide if you think no more birds are around, and get them into the shade as quickly as possible. So we'll move on to roost shooting. Roost shooting is another form of static hunting and follows the same principles as mentioned in the previous Corvid Control Air Rifle Fieldcraft video. It's particularly effective in the winter months when the trees are generally bare. You have already ascertained where the birds are coming in due to your prior observations. Concealment is important, as pigeons generally come into roost much earlier than the corvids do, and there is more light to shoot by, and therefore more light for you to be seen by. Use thick tree trunks and brush to cover yourself further, and stay as still as possible. Shooting up into trees is a dark art, and lots of practice is recommended. Shoot at pine cones, conkers, anything that presents itself for practicing. But generally when shooting at steep inclines, your point of aim must be lower. If a bird comes in but the shot isn't clear and obstructed by twigs or leaves, then wait for a clear shot, or leave the bird undisturbed, as it will decoy others into the same tree, which may present a much better opportunity. It's best to enter the wood about 2 to 3 hours before sunset, so as not to disturb any roosting birds and get set up for your ambush. Woodland static hunting is a term I use to describe an opportunistic ambush of general air rifle quarry species in the woodland environment. This can also produce results during the course of the day when pigeons head to the trees to digest their food and relax. The methods are exactly the same as the roost shooting methods, and obviously grey squirrels and corvids can be targeted too. Stalking, a form of mobile hunting. In my experience, this rarely produces any chances with wood pigeons. They have sharp eyesight, just like corvids, but are not as clever on the whole. If you find yourself in a situation where you have seen a pigeon and can approach unseen using available cover, then you may get the chance of a shot. For example, I once crawled along a hedgerow and got into range of a flock of pigeons feeding on drilled barley in the next field behind the hedge. Due to my observations, I knew there was a hole in this hedge and managed to shoot a pigeon through the hole. Pigeons can also be approached on the farmyard using the buildings for cover. Remember to always move with the buildings, walls or other cover to your left if you are a right-handed shooter. The opposite is true if you are left-handed. This is so as not to expose too much of your frame to the target. Lofting pigeons is a decoying method where full-bodied decoys are placed up into a favourable tree to attract them in for a shot. They should be placed using a lofting pole as high as possible and facing into the wind. A hide can be used, or the roost shooting and other forms of static ambush methods can be used. The only problem with lofting is the bulky equipment needed. So, I think that just about covers it. Hopefully during the warmer months when the decoying method seems to be more effective, at least for me that is, we shall see some footage of myself in action. But for those that would like to see a practical demonstration by an extremely proficient Air Rifle Marksman, search for Hunter's Vermin on YouTube. It's fair to say, in my early days, and even to this day, his work continues to inspire and teach. Thank you for watching, and I'll catch you guys in the field. Bye bye for now, folks.